It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first of 12 speakers. So as I mentioned, we had a lot of interest, and some of you on this in this conference will have submitted abstracts to present a talk at the conference. And unfortunately, it was just really, really high quality. It was very difficult. Went through a rigorous review process and looked at the program that we wanted to deliver. So going across the privacy enhancing technologies, the socio-political considerations, and what we needed to do is ensure we had a good balanced program. So I'm delighted that our first researcher is from a great institution that I've had the pleasure of engaging with on many times before, the Ada Lovelace Institute. So we've got Harry Farmer with us. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
Great to see you. And you're going to talk to us about biometrics for identification. What do practitioners need and what can government do? So I'll hand straight over to you, Harry. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction. So hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Harry Farmer. I'm a researcher at the Ada Lovelace Institute. So for those of you who don't know us, the Ada Lovelace Institute is a research and a deliberative body with a mission to make data and AI work for people in society. And one of the reasons we were keen to talk at this conference today is that since our inception, we've done a fair amount of work on biometrics, some of which you can see on this slide. So we've done Beyond Face Value, which was one of the first UK surveys looking into the attitudes of the public on facial recognition. Over the course of 2020, we did something that we called the Citizens Biometrics Council, which was a year-long deliberative public engagement exercise, surveying and investigating the views of the public on all sorts of biometric technologies. And we also currently have underway what we call the Riley Review, which is an independent legal review of the state of biometrics governance in the UK, which is due to report in the coming months. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about public views and worries about biometric systems and setting out how the public thinks about biometric identification and what concerns that they have. And then talking really about what we need to do to address those concerns, both in terms of how systems are designed and developed, and also in terms of how they're regulated and how they're governed. Now, biometric identification, I don't need to tell anyone in here, is an enormously powerful technology with a ton of applications across different domains and across different industries. And as I'm sure you'll all be painfully aware, however, biometric identification systems aren't universally loved or trusted. Facial recognition, for instance, has practically been the poster child for a controversial emerging technology over the past few years. And new disputes around the use of biometric ID systems are cropping up all the time. And as these technologies mature and as they become more visible and more common, these challenges are only likely to get worse. So for those developing these systems, this presents, I think, an obvious but pretty important question, which is how can biometric identification systems be developed and be deployed in a manner that takes seriously public views and public worries about these systems? And I think answering this question requires some insight into how the public thinks about biometrics. Now, as luck would have it, as I already said, over the course of 2020, the Ada Lovelace Institute ran a public deliberation exercise called the Citizens Biometrics Council, which was a year-long exercise with 50 members of the UK public, designed to understand their views on biometric technologies. So I hear you ask, what did we learn? What are the public worried about? And what do they want to see? It's worth saying really at the outset that there's actually a fair degree of optimism about the positive potential of biometric technologies on the part of the public. But critically, this is tempered by some significant concerns. And these can be broken down into, I think, two thematic clusters. One is around privacy, surveillance, and power. And the other cluster is around failure and exclusion and concerns about inaccuracy. So turning to the first of these two, we found with our deliberative exercise that the public are actually pretty aware of the ability of biometric identification tools and technologies to be used to undermine privacy. They're sensitive to the fact that biometric ID systems can be used to enable a particular kind of ambient surveillance that can be very difficult to become aware of and quite difficult to escape. And they are aware of the potential of that kind of surveillance to undermine the principles of free, open societies, though they put things in more roundabout terms. But I think that's what it boiled down to. But fortunately, the public were quite specific about the sorts of things that would reassure them. So they talked a lot about proportionality, so questions of when to use biometrics, and the steer clearly from them was don't use a biometric system when another form of identification or when another solution will do. And that proportionality also extended to what you do with biometric data when you hold on to it. So the steer there was don't hold on to more data than you need for longer than you need to, and don't share it unless that's absolutely unavoidable. And then there was also a lot of talk around consent and designing systems to enable consent. And here a few things came out. Firstly, this idea that consent, in order to be valid, requires transparency. So people want to know when and how biometric systems are being used. And if they don't, they can't be properly said to have consented to being subject to biometric processing. And similarly, there was this feeling that consent requires non-biometric alternatives. And it came out really clearly that if doing something you need to do is dependent on being subject to biometric processing, then you can't really be said to having consented to it. But at the same time, the public were actually quite level-headed about consent as well. They saw it wasn't a panacea, and they also saw that in some instances, consent can be quite impractical as something to rely on. And what really came up here was this awareness that it can be quite hard to withdraw consent in some situations, and it can be hard to understand exactly what you're consenting to. Another important caveat with consent, and not something that came out directly through the Systems Biometrics Council, but something that I think is really worth mentioning at this juncture, is that consent is fundamentally an individualistic solution to privacy concerns. But privacy itself is a collective endeavor. An individual's ability to hold on to his privacy is dependent on a critical mass of others choosing to do the same. So if no one else has opted out of a biometric ID system, for instance, then your opting out is less effective and quite conspicuous. And therefore, in addition to consent, if that's something we rely on, there needs to be some kind of universal baseline for privacy protection. And then finally, coming back to things that we got from the public, there was also a lot of talk about the preferences for active biometric identification systems over passive identification. Now, turning to the second set of worries, which were around failure and exclusion and worries about accuracy. So turning first to failure and exclusion. And when I'm talking about failure, I'm talking about biometric systems being unable to come to any conclusions whatsoever. So this would be a system, for instance, failing to recognize my face as my face, or being unable to read my fingerprint. And there were some fairly general worries about biometric ID systems failing at critical points from the public. But in addition to those, there were some really quite deep concerns from people who don't conform to particular phenotypic norms. So trans people, people with particular kinds of disabilities, really deep worries about them being locked out of biometric systems or being consistently misidentified by them, and a feeling of kind of marginalization being enhanced by that particular failure of biometric systems, and deep worries that came out of that. So certainly something to keep front of mind there. When it comes to accuracy, the thing that came up a lot were concerns around differential accuracy, which is when systems have different rates of accuracy for different groups. So the really famous example of this is how some facial recognition systems were found to have worse rates of accuracy for Black people and Black women in particular. Now, with both of these worries, the public did cite specific things that could ameliorate their concerns beyond simply developing more accurate and universally reliable systems. So a lot of these suggestions were around lowering the stakes for failure and error. And there was talk about the need to have humans in the loop so that errors can be flagged and contested. Again, there was a lot of talk about the need for non-biometric alternatives. And then more generally, there was just a general feeling amongst the public that there shouldn't be the use of biometric identification systems for anything where failure would be catastrophic. And again, it's worth noting that the public they did see the trade-offs involved in asking these things. there's only so much that you can ask for a human to be in the loop before you start to undermine the labor-saving potential of biometric identification systems. And the public did see that, but there was just, I think, overall this desire for proportionality and a desire to be risk-averse, particularly when the stakes are high. So these are hopefully some useful insights into public worries about biometric identification systems and how developers might address those worries. But there is a final thing that's worth mentioning when talking about the public, which was that our engagement with the public showed that public confidence in these systems is fundamentally contingent on the existence of clear, strong, and comprehensive regulation. Which just brings us to the second obvious but important question, which is, do we in the UK have the regulations that we need? And again, as chance would have it, the Ada Lovelace Institute has commissioned an independent legal review of the governance of biometric data in the UK, which is due to report in the coming months and which sheds some important light on this question. Now, this is a long, multifaceted legal analysis, so I'm not going to subject you to an exhaustive account of its findings first thing on a Monday morning for my sanity as much as for yours. But there are some striking and important points that are worth sharing at this stage. So the headline finding from this review is that the governance landscape for biometric data in the UK is not currently fit for purpose. And specifically, the review has found that current arrangements fail to provide users and developers of biometric systems with clarity on if and how biometric systems should be used. And if you need evidence of this, you need to look no further than the case of Ed Bridges versus South Wales Police, which demonstrated a huge amount of confusion over whether the use of live facial recognition by police was lawful. And it just shouldn't be the case that we have to wait for the end of long court battles to understand if and how to use something as complex and as powerful and as controversial as a biometric identification system. The second thing that came out was that current governance arrangements don't adequately apply to the use of biometric data in the private sector. Many of the pieces of legislation and the regulations constraining the use of biometric ID systems, such as the Public Sector Equality Act and the Surveillance Camera Code of Practice, only apply to the public sector. And finally, the review found that a problem with the governance ecosystem at the moment is that regulation and law doesn't unequivocally include biometric data used for classification rather than identification. And as you'll know, this is a huge emerging field of biometrics and one that presents, I would say, a tougher set of ethical and policy questions than biometric identification on its own. So the fact that biometric classification doesn't currently fall under governance arrangements is a big and very problematic lacuna. So given all this, what do we need to provide the public with the confidence that biometric technologies are subject to adequate regulation? Well, we believe we need a new technology-neutral statutory framework for biometric data, one which applies to the private sector as well as it does to the public sector, and which explicitly includes biometric data used for classification or categorization, as well as biometric data used for identification. Now, there's a lot of detail that I've skimmed over here, and I'm more than happy to elaborate on things where I can, but particularly with the legal side, I'm drawing on work that's ongoing. And in those cases, all I can say is I hope I've whet your appetite for research that we're due to release soon. So watch this space. Until then, I hope this has been a helpful insight into public worries about biometric identification. And for those of you intent on taking them seriously, and particularly developers, I hope this has given a sense of what you need to do when developing and designing your systems, and also what you need to be asking your government. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Harry. And it's great, as I said, I've been involved with the Lovelace on a number of things. We hope that we continue to engage with the Lovelace on these important areas. We've got a couple of questions, and it's interesting because I had my own question as well. And it was, so actually all three questions from different people are pretty much around the same kind of thing. So I'll put it to you. My own perspective, because of that, I think Matthew Ryder was involved in an event that your executive director was also involved in at the Royal Society around the live facial recognition. and the Ed Bridges. It was about the time of the Ed Bridges case. And the question that we've got is really about this public understanding. So both Fred Carter and Steve Wilson have asked about how sophisticated is the public's understanding of biometrics. So my own thought was around the trade-off. And Fred had said the difference between using biometrics for identification, which is of course 1 to N, and authentication 1 to 1, or is that part of this whole proportionality space? So it's really all three of us are interested in how much are the public really aware of the topic.
So that's a really good question, and I think that nicely prompts me to add some clarifications in, particularly around how the public deliberation exercise that we did, the Citizens Biometrics Council, worked. In terms of that exercise, what we did was we got 15 members of the public who were chosen, so they were representative of different groups of the public, so they were kind of nationally representative. And what you do with deliberative public engagement is you take them through a long process whereby you set out a lot of the policy issues, you set out how the technology works, so in this case biometrics, and we did set out the difference between different sorts of biometrics. So as you said, the difference between biometric authentication, biometric identification, and then also classification. So using biometrics to infer characteristics about people rather than just tell who they are or understand whether they are who they say they are. So those things were set out, and yeah, the process that we went through was one where we exposed the members of the public who we were engaging with to expert opinion and people who had different opinions on the legitimate use of biometrics within society. But by the end of that process, the process was engineered to make sure that the public did have an understanding of these nuances and the differences. In terms of the question about proportionality, I mean, a caveat I should introduce is, given that this is a conference on trustworthy digital identity, I was speaking specifically about biometrics for identification, and I suppose to an extent also biometrics for authentication as well, and putting a pin in that question of biometrics for classification. I think even if you're talking about biometrics for ID, though, there are questions about proportionality, and there are very different ways that you can deploy a biometric identification system. The fact that, for instance, live facial recognition can be used in an ambient way, in a way that it's very difficult to be aware of, compared to, for instance, giving a fingerprint scan, which is something that you have to actively kind of go through a process for. So I think despite the fact that there are these big kind of different forms of biometrics, and we were just talking about identification, I think you do still get different policy concerns and different societal concerns within identification itself. So I think those proportionality questions still need to be asked, and that was something we also get from the public.